Right, I think we'll start. Lots of new faces, which is great to see. Welcome. I'm James Rucker. I founded the Maudsley Psychedelic Society over a year ago now. We've been building slowly. We're a sort of academic and clinically focused interest group run out of King's College London and the Maudsley Hospital. I'm a psychiatrist and I'm a clinical lecturer here, specialising in mood disorders, and I have a particular interest in the therapeutic use of psychedelics. Very happy that a colleague of mine, Ben Sessa, who's a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist in the Southwest, has agreed to give us a talk. Ben has been interested in psychedelics since he was at medical school. He's a little bit older than me, not that much older than me, and tried to do his child and adolescent psychiatry training here, and told them about his interest in psychedelics, and didn't get in, which is a shame really, but I suppose it speaks of where we've come in the last few years in terms of attitudes towards this. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ben, and maybe we could give him a round of applause.
Thanks, James. I'd rather not use the microphone. If I shout, can you hear me? Yeah, I'll shout. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Great to be here at the Maudsley. It is very weird that you have a psychedelic society, because, yeah, it was 2002. I was just finishing my general psychiatry training in Camden and Islington, and I was applying for specialist training posts, and I came here to the Maudsley, and I talked in my interview about my interest in psychedelics, and I got lectured very strongly about how this is a crazy fringe subject that has no place in medicine and is a dangerous drug of abuse. And I didn't get the job, so I went to Oxford, and it's very great to therefore be here at the Maudsley. How times have changed, and I think it's really telling actually that the Maudsley of all places, this seat of academic psychiatry, is interested in this crazy hippie rubbish, which it is not. So, what is that? So there is a scared, bruised, humiliated, excluded, hurt little 10-year-old girl. But it's not. What you're looking at there is a filthy piece of scum. Public enemy number one, scrounging, benefit-scrounging, drug-addicted, 40-year-old adult sitting on the pavement outside Waitrose asking for 50p. Don't give her any money, it's her fault. She chose that lifestyle, she put herself there. She'll only spend it on booze if you give her some money. Now, that is so shocking, isn't it? That we turn off our understanding and empathy towards people when they move from childhood into adolescence and then adult mental health problems and addictions, and we forget the developmental roots of that pain. And my work as a child psychiatrist, and then I'm now working in adult addictions, I've followed in my own career path that development from working with maltreated and abused children into adolescents with mental health problems, adults with addiction problems, 30, 40, 50-year-olds with heroin, alcohol, crack cocaine addiction. And that has brought me to this substance, MDMA. And the cohort of patients I now look after as adults are the same cohort of abused kids. So it's a natural developmental pathway for me that comes to MDMA, and it's a natural developmental pathway for psychiatry that I believe is coming towards MDMA. So very much what we'll be talking about is the roots of trauma and the huge difficulties in treating trauma that we have, and the lack of efficacy in psychiatry for treating trauma at the moment, and why we're desperately in need of this new psychedelic renaissance for our profession. Because these young people and then older people are being failed by the current treatments, in my opinion. So, you all know what psychedelic drugs are at this wonderful society, so I don't need to do that. But just to put it in context with where MDMA sits. So MDMA certainly can be considered a psychedelic drug. It's not a classical psychedelic drug. So classical are those four that we have: LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and mescaline. Partial agonists at the serotonin 2A receptor. And then MDMA is part of this group called the entactogens. There's others in the class. There's the 2C series, there's MDA. But MDMA is the one that's kind of risen to the fore in recent years as the most popularly used recreational entactogen. But the others are increasingly used, 2CBs, 2C7s, those are all increasing, 2CI. Those are all increasing, aren't they? And then we've got the dissociative anesthetics, of which ketamine is very popular in Bristol, where I live. Phencyclidine is not very popular. It's kind of much bigger in the States. Nitrous oxide is hugely popular everywhere. Every festival you go to now, there'll be a tent next to you with all night long. Tetrahydrocannabinol certainly can be considered psychedelic at high doses. There's no doubt about that. Ibogaine, salvia. There's hundreds of different psychedelic drugs, and they all fit into different classes according to their receptor profiles. They also, many of them fall into these two classes, the tryptamines or the phenethylamines. MDMA is a phenethylamine, 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine. What's interesting about these is that these base chemicals, if you like, molecules, the tryptamine itself and phenethylamine, are actually endogenous brain chemicals. So we have those very clearly within our brains. And serotonin is a tryptamine, and it's a very small leap from serotonin to DMT, if you can see there from the molecular structure. And that does lead a lot of scholars to suggest that there is an endogenous psychedelic chemical, that there is a natural body-produced psychedelic chemical of some kind that's released in non-drug states, mystical states, spiritual states. There's a big debate within the psychedelic community about this and what the endogenous psychedelic could be and where it's made and where it acts. A lot of people, Rick Strassman's book in 1995 has just inspired so many minds to believe that DMT is the spirit molecule. It's made in the pineal gland, and that's what it is not the case. Okay, DMT has not been found in the human brain in significant amounts. I personally don't think the pineal gland has anything to do with it. People talk about the mysterious pineal gland. It's really not mysterious. The pineal gland is an extremely boring little gland in the centre of the brain that produces melatonin in response to light and regulates the sleep-wake cycle. It's not the least bit mysterious. I think it's only mysterious because it's kind of in the midline and it lines up with a chakra. So I think people are moving away from the pineal thing. There's a good chance that there is an endogenous psychedelic, and there's a good chance it's DMT because it's close related to serotonin. If it's going to be produced anywhere in the body, the gut or the lungs are much better potential sites, where the massive throughput of serotonin. DMT is active at a dose around about 7 milligrams and above. The pineal gland isn't much bigger than 7 milligrams anyway, so it's no way it's going to be producing enough DMT. The lungs, on the other hand, could produce enough DMT, potentially. So the jury is out as to what the endogenous chemical is, if indeed there is one. I would suggest there probably is one. You know, there seems to be a neurobiological underpinning to all of our mental states, so possibly an endogenous psychedelic. It's not MDMA. Now, what is a psychedelic experience? Well, it's a very hard question to answer, and I couldn't possibly answer it, because by definition it is ineffable, which means you can't really describe it. It's a feeling, it's a felt experience, it's something you need to experience. You can try and experience it, you can talk about distorted illusions in all the sensory modalities, increased range of thinking, access to repressed emotional memories. Ego dissolution is a really, really important part of it. The falling away of the labels that we hang on ourselves, that by how we describe ourselves. And these are very important. Ego is very, very important defense. We need to have those labels, or we will just be a mush. But the problem with many mental health problems is it's the rigidity and stuckness of certain labels that create problems. I had a high-dose psilocybin experience in an MRI scanner a few years ago with intravenous psilocybin, and experienced this ego dissolution. It was really quite remarkable. I was lying there in the scanner. They injected me, could well have been James actually, somebody or other injected me with psilocybin, and I was lying there thinking, right, I'm Ben, I'm a man, I'm a doctor, I'm in Cardiff, I'm in a scanner, and then it's like, okay, I'm not really sure where I am, but I know I'm Ben, and I know I'm in a scanner, and I know I'm Cardiff, and okay, I don't quite know where I am, but I know that I'm a man, and I've got a physical body. Okay, I don't really have a physical body as such, because there's not really any edges, but I kind of know who I am, I'm Ben, I'm myself. Then I'm like, well, I don't even know what Ben is, I no longer have that, I'm now just floating in space. But now I'm not even floating, because to float you have to be a thing, so I'm not even floating, I am space. Now I'm not even space, because that's the thing, I'm just I'm a collection of energy fields. So that's ego dissolution. It's all of those labels that we hang on ourselves that we need, you need that. You can't go around being an energy field the whole time. You'd run over, wouldn't you? But if you think about mental disorder and rigidity of mental disorder, and particularly addictions, the labels that our patients hang on themselves, I am worthless, I am useless, I'm a paedophile, I am unloved, I am unlovable, I'm a waste of space, I'm unwanted. These are awful labels. These are labels worth stripping away. And it's this ability to attack that rigidity of mental disorder that makes psychedelics quite valuable. Now, psychedelics are implicated in all of the world's religions. Okay, that's pretty well established now. And it makes sense. It makes sense from an anthropological point of view. If Terence McKenna was very keen on this idea. The idea of how did humanity move forward so quickly? Within the space of about 200,000 years, we went from being these non-sentient cave dwellers into these rich human societies in which we had art and we had spirituality and we had consciousness. Terence McKenna and other scholars would suggest that it was magic mushrooms that acted as a catalyst for development of humanity, or even development of human consciousness itself. And there's a lot of objections to that, but it does intuitively make sense to me. The idea of cave people sitting around a fire and intellectually coming up with God, that would be an interesting concept. It seems a bit far-fetched. Whereas take a psychedelic and you kind of have these spontaneous mystical feelings. You start to feel part of a cosmic oneness, and that's a very well-established fact that the spontaneity of mystical experiences, and the Roland Griffiths team at Johns Hopkins University have done a lot of work with that, demonstrating that naive users of psychedelics do have this spontaneous spiritual experience on psychedelics. So it would make sense. And of course all the world's religions, Christianity, what was the fruit that opened Adam's eyes to see the world as it truly appears? Is it the Staphyria cubensis mushroom? Most likely. Obviously the Rastafarian religion still use sacraments in the form of cannabis, and so the Hindu religion, ayahuasca is well established. What's interesting about these religions as well in the non-Western context is you get a crossing over. So the ayahuasca religion is very linked to Christianity as well, as are the Mazatec tribes' use of magic mushrooms. There's ancient pagan beliefs, but it's mixed in with Christianity. The Mazatec Mexicans that use psilocybin mushrooms believe that the mushrooms grew in the ground where Christ's tears dropped from his eyes on the cross. So you get this weird mixture of pagan and Christian beliefs. But of course, the churches themselves, particularly Christianity, would be very unhappy to suggest that their roots are in psychedelics, but there's pretty good evidence that indeed they were. So psychedelics kind of burst into the Western culture, as you know, in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and had their heyday in the early 1950s. In many ways, it was all over by the beginning of the 1960s. But then when we think about the psychedelic revolution in the 60s, it's all the stuff that came after that. The medical therapeutic applications were kind of pretty much ground down by the mid-60s. So it was 1938 that Albert Hofmann discovered LSD. He was working, as you know, on derivatives of the ergot fungus, the substance secreted by ergot fungus called lysergic acid, and he was adding different side chains and different derivatives of it. His 25th derivative, lysergic acid diethylamide, he accidentally absorbed and had the world's first acid trip. And any other scientist at that point might have just discarded it, put it away, labelled it toxic and not gone back to it. But Hoffman, being Hoffman, he said, this is interesting, and he went about carrying out further research. And a few days later, he decided to conduct an experiment on himself, as you know. He weighed out the smallest amount he could on the lab scales. It only went down to 250 micrograms. So he said, I'll weigh out the smallest amount and I'll increase it in increments of 50 micrograms until I get an effect. Now, 250 micrograms of LSD is a whopping dose. You know, an average blot of LSD these days is probably 50 to 75 micrograms. So he really jumped in at the deep end there. And so the company he works for, Sandoz, they bottled the stuff up, called it Delicid, sent it out all over the world to psychiatrists, and two main fields grew. In Europe, we had this psycholytic psychotherapy in which low doses, 25, 50, maybe 100 micrograms, would be given to patients on a weekly basis as part of psychoanalytical, psychodynamic work, and it's really to loosen stuck patients in their psychoanalytical work. In the States, this concept of psychedelic psychotherapy arose. This was much higher doses, 3, 4, 5, up to 800 microgram doses of LSD, just given once, and you get this big, massive, mystical peak experience, and then you spend the weeks after that integrating and exploring the material that came out. And that was all going along very swimmingly, and the LSD was being applied to all sorts of different parts of psychiatry. Around 40,000 patients took LSD before it was banned in the mid-60s. Touched all aspects, and actually, this is before the whole drug revolution started. LSD was going to really be the next big thing in psychiatry. In fact, the 1961 APA meeting in the States was entirely dedicated to LSD, as was the 1963 Royal College Psychiatrists meeting, although it wasn't called that, it was called the Medico-Psycho Society, I think, back then. 1963 meeting, entirely dedicated to LSD. This wasn't some weird fringe thing, this was cutting-edge biological psychiatry. And then it all came to a horrible end in 1966 when the drugs were aligned with the left-wing protests. There was a clampdown on drug misuse, and they were maligned by the government and banned. And now, drug users don't really care whether things are illegal or not. And I'm going to have a really good bash at the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act tonight. But doctors don't like doing illegal things generally, unless they're away from home doing talks in London. And so the research stopped, it all ground to a halt, and that was the end of psychedelic therapy. And the 70s and the 80s were pretty much the dark ages in psychedelic research. It became very difficult to get licenses to do this. So that was your introduction in the history of psychedelics, and you all know that because probably every speaker has done that. So we'll move away from that and we'll talk about child abuse. So children are really little, aren't they? And they're very vulnerable, but also really strong. Actually, they're quite resistant as well. But children need to be cared for in an environment in which is nurturing, loving, and they need to be praised, and they need to be played with, and they need to be looked after. And the reciprocal dance of attachment is so important for solid psychological development. I don't know if there are any child psychiatrists in the audience. If your psychiatrist is wondering what to do, please do child psychiatry. It is the most valuable education in mental health training you will get. Everything you learn in adult psychiatry, you will learn in CAMS, plus more. Child development is the root of all of us. We are all our parents. I'm sorry to disappoint you there, but you will become your mother and your father. The stuff we learn in those early years is crucial. You know, that becomes the blueprint for intimacy. That our core concepts of what is love, what is protection, what is trust. Those things that you learn in those very early years, and they get very stuck when they're distorted. And it is a reciprocal dance, you know. Attachment is an incredible thing to watch in an infant or children under 24 months. They There's a really famous psychology experiment in which there's a mum, there's a little boy, I think he's like 18 months, sitting in a high chair. The mum's playing with him and laughing, and it's very reciprocal. When a child goes like that, you cannot help do it in return. It's this natural mirroring. If child smile, no, there's been very good, robust tests for this. It's impossible unless you have certain disorders or problems like autism. It's very hard not to smile when a little baby smiles at you. You just break into a smile. And that wonderful reciprocal dance is what builds it up. The mum does one thing, the child does another thing, the mum does another thing. Now, in this experiment, it's really distressing. The mum is playing and the psychologist says, right, go blank. And the mum just goes like this. And the child is kind of trying to get the attention and then starts getting really anxious and starts writhing around and then starts crying. And you can see the mum trying really hard to and then the mum bursts into tears and the psychologist said, it's okay, you can hug each other. It's just an experiment. But so vital for the development of attachment is that reciprocal relationship. And different forms of child abuse, and the ones that hit the radar, sexual abuse, physical abuse, the ones that social services get interested in. Interestingly, those are not necessarily the forms of abuse that cause the most mental illness. And most people might not understand that. Emotional abuse and neglect are devastating for lifelong mental health problems. I've worked with so many young people who have been very unwell with developing borderline personality disorder. And we've searched through social services records, there must have been severe abuse, must have been severe physical abuse, must have been severe sexual abuse, and as often it is not the case. It's a child that grows up in an atmosphere where they're just put down. You're useless. We didn't want you. You aren't loved. Everything you do is going to be rubbish. No one will ever love you. Those little comments are devastating to a child's psychological development. So, it's also the environment in which children grow up. So, environments that are unstable, criminality, drug addiction, domestic violence, witnessing domestic violence. How does a little boy judge how to look after a female partner other than by how they see their father treat their mother? These things really stick. It's very hard as an adult to have these intimate relationships when you've had such a distorted childhood experience. Lack of boundaries, that's a good one. So there are two main rules in parenting, or in CAMS for that matter. Two main rules of parenting. Number one is play, praise, love, nurturance, care, all of the lovely nurturing things. And number two is boundaries, the B word. It's crucial to good parenting. Children like rules. They say they don't, but they really do. They like to know who's the boss. They like to know that they're not the boss. It's very important that your child doesn't win that battle in those early years. Because if that child wins that battle as to having the third biscuit, there's no way you're going to keep that girl off the back of that motorbike when she's 14. So boundaries are vital and they are very stabilising for a child. I see far more patients, children, adolescents with mental health problems due to permissive parenting than I do to overly authoritarian parenting. And of course, social economic factors. When we work in mental health, we work with people on the bottom rung. We work with people who, before they were born, they had the odds stacked against them. Low social economic status, exclusion, racism, lack of opportunities in terms of employment and career. These are people who, they've really got the odds stacked against them, and this is why we need to be so compassionate. So, we forget this developmental pathway, like I said at the beginning. We turn off our empathy. You watch programs like Children in Need, and there's all these little tiny abused children, and everyone's giving them loads of money and saying, oh, it's so sad, these poor little victims. What happens to them when they're 11 or 12? The hood goes on, out comes the reefer, and then they're buying and selling amphetamine, and by the time they're 19, 20, they're buying and selling heroin, they're addicted to alcohol, and they're stealing off you, and they're maligned, they're just these awful, terrible people. And I cannot bear that when I see that in mental health professionals or general medical professionals of any kind. I hate that M word, manipulation, and don't careful with her, she'll manipulate you. I say to these kids, I say, good for you for being manipulative, you clever, resourceful kid. If you were not manipulative, if you didn't learn to lie, cheat, steal, you would have died when you were 5, because you weren't being fed. If you're resourceful, and when they're cutting themselves, oh, she's just seeking attention. Good for you, thank you, you have my attention. I will give you my attention. Attention seeking is a very important survival technique in people who are neglected. And we have to hold on to that compassion. Now, the way to hold on to that compassion, obviously, as clinicians, is we are morally and ethically good people, although, weirdly, not all of us. But also it's about understanding the science of it. This isn't just fluffy moral and ethics. This is understanding the scientific developmental pathway. If we are brutal and misunderstand those difficult antisocial adults, it's because we're too stupid to look at the science of psychopathology development. So you need to learn that. So PTSD, now post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder in psychiatry that when we started talking about this 20 or 30 years ago, it was really confined to a single catastrophic life-threatening event, like a serious assault, a fire, a car accident, in which you really thought you were going to die. But what we broadened the diagnosis in the last 10 or 15 years, and now we talk about complex PTSD. Now, with complex PTSD, the traumatic index events do not need to be necessarily life-threatening. They can be small but repetitive over many years events that are extremely distressing and terrifying, but you kind of know you're not going to die. But the end phenotype is the same. The PTSD that you then express is the same, whether it's come from a single catastrophic life event or from child abuse. And we all know the core features of PTSD. It's a re-experiencing phenomena. So this is flashbacks during the day or nightmares at night, in which you have this dissociative reaction, in which you disengage from the world in which we are in, and you kind of go back within your memory to that moment. And you relive the moment in all the sensory modalities. People talk about they can hear, they can smell, they can touch. It's like they're there. And they glaze over. And, you see it working with teenagers especially. You'll be talking to them about their trauma and they'll just suddenly freeze and start scratching themselves. So we have dissociative episodes. We have hypervigilance. People who've had these experiences are hypervigilant. They're on edge. There's an assailant around every corner. They have a lot of emotional insecurity, a lot of emotional dysregulation, lots of self-harm, significant proportion of completed suicide. About 15% of people with chronic PTSD will kill themselves. It's a very disabling condition and it's very hard to treat. 50% treatment resistant. And why is that? Well, what I would be proposing is because we don't have good treatment for trauma. So we treat it symptomatically. The drug treatments for PTSD, there's no single drug, apart from MDMA, that treats PTSD. We treat it symptomatically. If they're depressed, give them an antidepressant. If they can't sleep, give them a hypnotic. If their hypervigilance kind of tips over into paranoia and psychosis, give them an antipsychotic. If their mood's going up and down, give them a mood stabilizer. So these patients come in on a whole load of different drugs. They've also got loads of psychosomatic symptoms, so they're also on tramadol for their bad back and all the rest of it. No single drug. Massive polypharmacy, real problem. High rates of self-harm, suicide, high rates of drug and alcohol misuse, because those drugs work. If you really want to blank out your feelings, forget the stuff your doctor's going to give you. Nothing hits the spot like a barrel full of heroin. So, what are the psychological treatments? Well, the psychotherapists amongst you may argue with this, but in my experience after 18 years in psychiatry, pretty much the most important part of psychotherapy, all of the psychotherapies, whether it's CBT, DBT, CAT, IPT, what have I missed out? Did I say DBT? Psychoanalytic therapy, psychodynamic therapy. The main thing is actually an old wives' tale. A problem shared is a problem halved. Tell me about your rape. Tell me about your pain. Tell me about that night when you were 8 years old and your grandfather came into the bedroom. And that is a wonderful thing, to reach that stage with a patient where you've built up trust and you can start to explore trauma. But the trouble is that only works for about 50% of people with severe trauma. For a significant half, the minute you mention that word rape, they are out the door. You've lost them. They've disengaged. They're back to the vodka. They're back to the heroin. Because, by the time you get them at 20, 30, 40 years old, they've spent their whole life doing everything but think about that night when they were 8. Their whole ego defense mechanism, their heroin addiction, their alcohol addiction, their self-harm, their multiple admissions into hospital on section, their suicide attempts. Everything has been to not go there. And then you sit there as a therapist and say, tell me about your rape. Of course they can't engage. They dissociate. So it's a very hard treatment. It's a very hard illness to treat. Now, brief physiology lecture, 2 parts of the brain. The amygdala here is a very primitive, old part of the mammalian brain. It's not just humans that have it, many other mammals have it. And it fires in response to stress or stress in the environment or trauma. If you think you're at risk, something's dangerous, the amygdala will light up. That's the red one. So a guy comes running into the room with a knife. It's like, shit, I'm going to die. Fight or flight, it triggers this hormonal response. Get out, fight, you're in danger. Now, slightly after that, the prefrontal cortex kicks in. Now, the prefrontal cortex, the green blob there, is much more sophisticated. This is something that probably only humans have. Maybe some of higher primates have it. This is the part of the brain where we use logic and reasoning and we rationalise the situation and we overcome that instinctive drive to run with a bit of sort of like, well, hang on, looking at this guy with the knife, he's actually got a chef's hat on and he's holding a menu. It's probably fine. Now, what we know about PTSD and child development is when a child grows up in an environment where they never know, when the guy coming into the room is, what are they going to do? What's their mum going to do today? Is she going to give me a kiss or a cuddle? Are we going to sit on the floor and do a jigsaw? Or is she going to stab me? Is she going to burn me with a cigarette? Or is she going to sexually abuse me? When is that lack of consistency in that parenting and that environment? You build up an intense amygdala response. And this is very well demonstrated. PTSD has an exaggerated amygdala response. People with PTSD find things frightening that the rest of us don't. And, as a double whammy, they have a shrunken prefrontal response. They're not so good at rationalising. They're not so good at talking themselves down. I saw a patient last night, actually. And we were talking about whether or not she was trying to get this job. And she went for the job interview. And we played out the 2 scenarios that she either gets the job or she doesn't get the job. And both her reasonings were incredibly negative. It's like, if I get the job, if I don't get the job, it's because I'm crap and I'm rubbish and they're very astute and they know what they're talking about. If I get the job, it must be because they're really scraping the barrel and there was no one else that applied and there must be some kind of catch. It's like, for God's sake, you're in a lose-lose situation. Even if something good happens to you, you can't see the benefit of it. This is all about an inability to have a prefrontal response that can be positive. So, psychiatry in the 21st century, where are we? Well, let's go back to the 19th century. I would say we are in psychiatry today where we were in general medicine at the end of the 19th century. Now, at the end of the 19th century, humanity was losing the battle to the infectious diseases. We knew people were dying of smallpox. We knew people died after they'd had operations. We knew that if you got a severe respiratory infection, you'd probably die. We didn't know why. We were starting to learn about the microorganisms, but we didn't have an antibiotic. And it wasn't until the antibiotics came in at the beginning of the 20th century that humanity started winning the battle. We finally had something that attacked the root cause of the infection. Before then, all we could do was treat the symptoms of the infection. So a good analogy is taking paracetamol when you have an infection. If you have an infection, which is due to a microorganism, you can take paracetamol. It works, it lowers your temperature, makes you feel a little bit better, but it's not an antibiotic. It doesn't actually attack the microbes, it just resolves the symptoms a little. I would propose that that's where we are in psychiatry today. We're very good at epidemiology, just like we were back then. In the 19th century, there were endless encyclopedias about smallpox and respiratory diseases and TB, but no answers as to how to treat them. Today we do that in psychiatry. It's crazy, these diagnostic manuals we write. DSM, ICD. In Bristol, our psychiatry epidemiology department is superb. We're wonderful at tracking disorders as depression, anxiety, PTSD, addictions. We know who gets these. We know why people get these. But we don't have a decent treatment. We have a whole cacophony of symptomatic treatments. And that's what happens when you take an SSRI. It's like taking a paracetamol. It doesn't treat trauma, an SSRI antidepressant drug. It masks the symptoms. It makes you feel a little bit better. It raises the mood. It does nothing to actually go there to attack the traumatic issue. But maybe this does. So, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA. It ticks so many boxes for the perfect drug for psychotherapy, for attacking trauma. So it's a psychedelic drug. But it's not a particularly perceptually disturbing psychedelic drug. A little bit of distortion, visual distortion, but probably that's due to the saccadic eye movements more than an actual sensual effect. A little bit of, there's definitely music sounds better. I mean, even like psytrance is mildly tolerable. I wouldn't go as far as to say dubstep, but some people, It's short acting, 2 to 5 hours. It's not like 8 to 12 hours like classical, or 12 to 24 hours for mescaline. Short acting, less perceptual disturbances. So very clinically manageable, which is important. Because clinical deliverability is important when we're looking at new drugs. It's almost always pleasurable. Now, this is really important because you want patients to tolerate the treatment. And, I have no problem with LSD and psilocybin psychotherapies. These are fantastic therapies. But they are more difficult, I think. A lot of patients really do not like the effect of classical psychedelics. They can go either way. Whereas MDMA, you cannot take MDMA at the threshold dose and not enjoy it. I challenge you to do that. There's only one person in the whole world who's done a study in which negative affect was found in MDMA users. It's a chap called Andy Parrott. Everybody else, it works. It's like opiates. There are a few drugs in psychopharmacology that have such an invariably pleasurable effect. Opiates is another. I challenge any of you to smoke some heroin and not love it. You will. If you don't have a brain, because this is a hardwired aspect of psychopharmacology. These drugs are pleasurable. Cocaine, crack cocaine. I challenge any of you to smoke a crack pipe and not love it. You will. Now, I'm not saying these are good, healthy drugs to take. I'm just saying this is psychopharmacology. It's hardwired. Now, immense problems go with those drugs. Don't get me wrong. But the point about all drugs, and the difference between drug use and drug abuse, is not the drug. It's prohibition. Prohibition results in harm. Prohibition causes drug users to be drug misusers, criminalising people, reducing access to services, increasing harm, increasing deaths. And successive governments have blood on their hands for that. So we'll come to that in a minute. But the best thing about MDMA is this weird ability to enhance empathy. So the receptor profiles, again, it's weird. It's like it is the perfect drug. All the receptors that it hits seem to tick all the right boxes. So the 1A1B receptors, serotonin receptors, that's the kind of lovey, ecstasy, positive mood, anxiolytic, antidepressant effect that recreational users like about ecstasy. It also hits the 5-HT2A receptors like the classicals. Not as intense. It's not quite so ego-dissolutionizing, whatever, as LSD, psilocybin, but it does open the mind to new possibilities a little bit, which is a good thing in psychotherapy. It has this very paradoxical effect that the dopamine receptors, it's a stimulant, that's the amphetamine part of it. Dopamine-mediated stimulation keeps you up, which is good because it motivates you to engage in therapy. But paradoxically, and again, very weird from a pharmacological point of view, alpha-2 activity causes relaxation, chills you out. And I don't know if any of you used MDMA, but there is that weird sense of being speeded up and relaxed at the same time. This puts you in this optimal arousal zone. You want a bit of chilling out, because if you were too speeded up and you've got that hypervigilance around PTSD, then you'd be too anxious. So you're dropped into this perfect zone. But it's really this effect on empathy and bonding that's important. MDMA releases a hormone called oxytocin, and oxytocin is released from the brains of breastfeeding mothers. It is implicated in attachment and bonding. And in totality, what you get with the MDMA experience within therapy is a person who is able to be with their trauma. And that is what's so vital. They can, for the first time in their lives, sit and talk about those things. Where in the past, the word rape and they'd be out the door, they can say, yeah, I can tell you about that. I can talk about that. What MDMA does is it allows access to the recall of those traumatic memories in a way that patients have not been able to do before. It shifts them from that 50% who can do trauma-focused psychotherapy, it shifts them out of the treatment-resistant into the 50% who can do it. I think of it as a life jacket or a bulletproof vest that you can wear to do your trauma therapy. And, it's not ecstasy. The patients aren't dancing around the room having a euphoric experience. It is still difficult, hard, trauma-focused work. They're thinking about these things that they've never wanted to think about. But with MDMA, they've got the strength to do it. And it's that sense of love, in a way. These are patients who have never had an experience of love. They've never really had positive affect. They don't really know what it feels like. And people take MDMA in a therapeutic context and they say, I had no idea I was capable of these feelings. And the therapist will say, well, yes, you are. These are in you, and this is you, and you can. And this allows the process of healing. And, weirdly, MDMA does the complete opposite of PTSD. It boosts the prefrontal cortex, and it shrinks the amygdala. Things that normally we find frightening are not frightening or scary, and things that we normally are relatively benign are suddenly wonderful. Now, this is a transient drug-induced effect. This is illusion, you may argue. And it kind of is illusion. No one's suggesting it's anything other than a transient drug-induced effect. But what the research shows is it lasts. And the work you do, the psychotherapeutic work you do on MDMA lasts. You can come to those resolutions about yourself and about your past and your history, and they are sustained and maintained without needing to take the drug again and again. And one of the projects we're doing in Cardiff is looking at that relationship between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Taking patients with PTSD, putting them in an fMRI scanner, traumatizing them mildly by playing them narrative scripts of their traumatic experiences, and looking at their amygdala and prefrontal cortex, versus placebo with the hypothesis that they will have a reduced amygdala response and a boosted prefrontal response, and that will relate also to their subjective fear response. So the Cardiff study is not a therapeutic study. We're not doing any therapy. It's a mechanistic study. So when we look at MDMA clinically, therapeutically, what's really important is you don't take MDMA every day. You don't even take it every week. In a course of psychotherapy, whether it's 8, 10, 12, 16 sessions, weekly sessions, 2 or 3 of them will be MDMA assisted. The other sessions are normal face-to-face, non-drug sessions. So there'll be a few preparation sessions without any medicine, then there'll be a drug session, a few weeks of integration sessions, another drug session, a few more integration sessions, and then follow-up. And this graph here is from Michael Mithoff's pilot study with PTSD. So 2 groups of patients, they've all got PTSD when they come in. At the end of the treatment, those who had MDMA do not have PTSD. Well, 15% have PTSD. So a massive reduction in symptoms. Now, this isn't just symptom reduction. This is no longer satisfying the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. They are cured. Now, we don't use the cure word in psychiatry. We have got used to our profession being palliative. We've lost all hope in psychiatry, and this is really sad. If you're 20, 30 years old and you go to your psychiatrist and you have severe anxiety disorder, PTSD, OCD, or depression, or addictions, especially addictions, there's a pretty good chance you'll be going back to that psychiatrist when you're 60 or 70. But that's really not good enough. It's very, very poor after 100 years of modern psychiatry that we're like that in psychiatry. We've got used to this. We've got used to this learned, helpless approach, that people don't really get better. We can manage the symptoms. And the reason is because we're not tackling trauma. We're masking the symptoms. We're papering over it with SSRIs. Now, just as by way of reference, the current best treatment, NICE guideline treatment, which is a combination of trauma-focused CBT and an SSRI, or EMDR and an SSRI, brings you down to about 45%. So this blows out of the water the current best treatment. And it's a pilot study, and we need to do more work. And we're hoping to do phase 3 studies with MDMA PTSD in a couple of years in this country. In a couple of sites, maybe here if it's developed, if there's infrastructure. Here's another interesting thing. Not only does it work within the second, but it lasts. So this, the long-term follow-up study to Mithoff's first pilot study, looking at the patients around between sort of 3 and 4 years later, 3.8 year average later, the results are just the same. They've had no further courses of MDMA. Many of them have come off their SSRIs, and they come back 3.5 years later, and they're still well. So it works, it lasts, you don't have to keep taking it. Unlike the SSRIs, which you take every single day, day in, day out, for weeks, months, years, decades, just to mask the symptoms. Is MDMA dangerous? Is MDMA safe? In medicine, we don't use black and white terms like safe and dangerous. Those are crazy things. In medicine, all medical interventions are invasive, all of them. From sticking plasters to cancer chemotherapy. They all hurt. They all have negatives. Plasters really hurt when you have to pull them off. But they are also pretty good at stopping venous blood flow and allowing a wound to not get infected. So they have their place. Cancer chemotherapy, that really hurts. Or your hair falls out, although that's not necessarily such a bad thing. And you can die, But if you don't do it, you could die. So what we do, we talk about risk versus benefit analysis. That's how we look at safety in medicine. If the benefits outweigh the risks, then it's worthwhile. And when you're there with your patient and you're thinking about any treatment, whether it's starting a drug or recommending psychotherapy or cancer chemotherapy, you have that debate in your head. Is this treatment efficacious and safe for this patient at this point compared to not doing it? And you do that in your head and you say, yes, it is, have a plaster. Or cancer chemotherapy. Or I'm going to cut off your leg. Or I'm going to remove loads of loops of bowel. Or I'm going to stop your heart and lungs and attach you to a machine. You make that decision. Yet in this subject, we are constrained by this peculiar situation of, well, it's not safe, without people actually looking at the broader picture about benefit analysis. So, clinically, when I used to do these talks, by the way, half the lecture would be about safety and risk. I just don't bother now, okay? It is absolutely clear. The psychedelic drugs, the classical psychedelic drugs, MDMA as well, are incredibly safe. Very, 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 very safe drugs, okay? In the UK, every weekend, around 500 to 750,000 doses of ecstasy are taken. Every weekend for the last 25 years. We have a mortality rate of about 5 deaths a year once you've taken into account concomitant drugs, particularly opiates and alcohol. Very safe, and a remarkably safe drug. Now, I didn't used to say that. When I started out doing these talks, I'd spend hours kind of trying to justify ecstasy use and maybe we can do it safely. I just don't bother. We just don't go there. Okay, these are incredibly safe drugs. Yet, many people still don't know that in the general public. And they ought to. And you as professionals and clinicians absolutely need to know this. You need to have an evidence-based approach to this question about safety. Now, nothing is 100% safe. Absolutely not. I am not saying that. But it's about risk-benefit analysis. If you've had 20 to 30 years of untreated PTSD, you've been sectioned, you've tried to kill yourself, you've lost your children, you're addicted to heroin, and then someone says, is taking 125 milligrams of MDMA in a clinical setting with a doctor and a psychologist and a nurse, and you've had an ECG and you've had a blood test and you're screened and you're followed up for weeks, months afterwards, can we justify that? Do you think we can? Yes, we bloody well can. Absolutely. If there's a chance that this is going to shift them from that rigid position of untreated PTSD, that's risk-benefit analysis. So it's not just, is it safe? Sorry to labour that point. And yeah, ecstasy, whatever ecstasy is whatever someone tells you is ecstasy. The MDMA we use is 99.98% pure. And really expensive. And started out really cheap. Started out at $325 a gram, but the costs have all gone through the roof, and we're now paying probably around about £25,000 for the 10 grams we need. So, £25,000 probably. I'll do it for 20 though. 10 grams. 10 grams, yeah. It's actually being encapsulated just over the road from here as well. So, yeah. The Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 is the biggest piece of pseudoscience. It's an utterly ridiculous document that has no bearing on psychopharmacology. It's a dangerous piece of legislation. The classes, Class A, B, C, have no relevance to the drugs that are in them. Successive governments have killed thousands of people by maintaining this terrible policy. It's up there with homeopathy in terms of its pseudo-scientific basis. There is no basis for it whatsoever. It's dangerous. It reduces access to services. Most people die from drugs because of the way they're taken. All drugs can be taken safely, all of them, even heroin and crack cocaine. People die when they take drugs in an unsafe way, and they take drugs in an unsafe way because they take them in secret, they don't get support, they don't get help, and they don't know how to take them. By far the best social political policy that could have come is to legalise and regulate all drugs. These are the really dangerous ones. Now, I work in Western Supermare for one of my days, and I call this the Western Quintet, because all of my patients, whatever they come in, whether they've got, a dodgy kneecap or schizophrenia, they're all on quetiapine, mirtazapine, zopiclone, tramadol, and pregabalin. We throw these drugs at our patients. The pharma industry chucks these things. Some go up, some go down, some help you sleep. Then you start taking things to help you wake up because you've been asleep. And then you start taking things to help you to sleep because the drugs are too alerting. It's absolutely ridiculous. None of them work. So we're still met with this idea that psychotherapy is somehow weird. It's not weird, Sometimes I'm introduced as a controversial speaker. I'm not controversial. This isn't controversial at all. This is safe and efficacious medicine. This is delivered by a clinician who's found this position through clinical judgment and seeing patients and seeing what works and what doesn't work. Medicine is intrinsically invasive. It's not a level playing field. That's what that is there. So, I gave a talk at the Royal College a few years ago about LSD, and a guy stood up in the audience and said, "I can't believe you're saying LSD is safe." He was an A&E consultant. He said, "Somebody came into my department last week and they'd taken 17 tabs of acid, and they were naked doing somersaults in the waiting room." And I said, "Okay, and did you need to admit him?" No. He went home with his friends. Was he referred on to psychiatry? Did you follow him up? And he went, yeah, we followed him up. He didn't get a referral to psychiatry, he just was fine. I said, "So you give me an example of why you think what I'm saying is dangerous." Of a patient that's come into the department and taken 17 times the recommended dose of the drug. What if it happened if he'd taken 17 grams of cocaine? Or 17 bottles of wine? He'd be in ITU or he'd be dead. So there is a skilled professional doctor there who, they just hear the word drug, LSD, and the immediate thing, dangerous. It's outrageous. It's sloppy pharmacology. It's bad science. This is bad. We're going to the pub later, actually, I think, aren't we? Alcohol. This country's relationship with alcohol is peculiar. It's outrageous, actually. Our European cousins looking on us, and they just think, "What is wrong with you guys?" We don't realise, because we're immersed in it. The UK problem with alcohol is immense. You walk down the street, quadruples for £1. Here on breakfast TV, children's TV, "What are you doing tonight?" "I'm going to get lashed." It's intrinsic in our culture. It's very odd indeed. And it's very dangerous, really dangerous. And the drinks industry, I think I don't like conspiracy theories because psychedelic research is rife with people who like conspiracy theories, so you have to be really careful. But it does sort of feel like a conspiracy theory. You do wonder why the alcohol industry has so much power. There's kind of three groups of people who don't want any change to drug industry. One is the mafia, the criminal underworld, who run this multi-trillion-dollar business. Cannabis is the third biggest cash crop on the planet, second only to wheat and rice, and totally unregulated. It's trillions of dollars is spent on this drug that's completely outside governments. So that's one group, the criminals. They are very, very pleased that we prohibit drugs, because they're incredibly popular and expensive, but they own them. The second group of people are the kind of dead in the water, I'm not going to use the name in the newspaper, Middle England, stuck moral, ethical objection, drugs are bad. Pint in one hand, fag in the other. But that's okay because they're not drugs. Drugs are bad. And then the third group of people who don't want any change to the drug laws are the drinks industry. They're very keen to hold the monopoly on the only altered state we're allowed. So, and there's a lot of money, So the entire annual budget for the NHS inpatient treatment for alcohol detox and inpatient rehabilitation is equivalent to the first 6 seconds of the new Smirnoff advert. This is the kind of money that we've got in the drinks industry. So we're doing a study in Bristol in which we're going to take patients post-detox, so they're going to have their medical detox, get dry, as we call it, and then they go into an 8-week course of psychotherapy with MDMA. Now, most of the research, all of the addiction research on classical psychedelics, they've all found the stronger effect size comes from the depth of the mystical or spiritual experience. The more the patient has a mystical or spiritual experience, the more they have a stronger abstinence from whatever substance they're addicted. Now, MDMA typically doesn't have a strong mystical or spiritual experience. About 10 to 15% of first-time threshold MDMA users will talk about a spiritual experience, but it's not up there with the 80 or 90% you get with LSD and psilocybin. So that's probably not how it's going to work, although it may work in that way. We know it's going to work really well on empathy, and we know it's going to work really well on trauma. So we hope it's going to work. And the study we're doing, it's an 8-week course, 10 sessions, 2 MDMA sessions on weeks 3 and 7, on session 3 and 7, follow up the next day, follow up phone calls for a week after each MDMA session, but most of it is face-to-face non-drug psychotherapy, and then follow up at 3, 6 and 9 months. So this is an open-label feasibility study, proof of concept study. We're not having a control group, so at the end of it we won't be able to say whether any improvements in quality of life or abstinence are due to the drug or to the psychotherapy or to both or neither. That's fine because it's so radical. No one's ever used MDMA therapy as a treatment for addictions. It's the first time in the world this has been done. So it's a safety and tolerability study. If nobody dies, then we go on and do the next one. And I don't see why they should die. They might die, actually, because people with alcohol use disorder do die. So we have to be very careful to separate the adverse effects of the drug from the fact that these people do live very chaotic lives. There's our team. So Laurie on the end, she's a co-therapist. So it's a typical dyadic male-female co-therapist pair. And as I said, it's all about tackling rigidity. It's breaking through those labels that our patients have hung on themselves. And, you know, it's the peak experience. Psychedelics provide a safe peak experience. Other ways of getting a peak experience, you know, you get people who get a bang on the head and they change their personality radically. That happens sometimes. Religious conversion, we all know people who are complete bastards and then they find Jesus and now they're all lovely. It's really irritating, but it happens, you know, sometimes it takes that stepping out of yourself, a mystical experience, to kind of really change. But generally we don't change, yeah? The stuff you guys carry around in your heads, the opinions you have about yourself and others, the opinions you have about intimacy and love and protection and care have arisen in your first 36 months. And it's really hard to change them. Dipsomania was the old-fashioned term for alcoholism, and that's what William James said in 1902, that was. That's me in safety glasses and a helmet up at Sterling Laboratories in Newcastle watching our kilo being made a few months ago. It was just a bubbling brown liquid in a flask when I went up there, but it's now all packaged into nice little vials and crystalline white. So just almost coming to an end now. When I started doing this work 15 years ago, as I found when I came here to Maudsley, didn't get a job, people say, you know, some of my tutors said, this career suicide, you know, you can't do this, why don't you do something nice like SSRIs or antipsychotics? It's not career suicide at all, okay? If your tutors tell you that, what they need to do is start reading their journals, okay? This is not a fringe, crazy subject. This is not just a bunch of hippies at Glastonbury anymore. This is cutting-edge neuroscience. This is where mental health is going. All of these top universities, neuroscience departments, have now got active psychedelic programs running. It's not a fringe subject. All the top journals are publishing on a monthly basis psychedelic research articles. In fact, we're just about to overtake the 60s. You know, people talk about the 60s as the psychedelic era. It's nothing to what it is today. Since the 1990s onwards, we've been gaining, and this is actually out of date, because 2017, it's probably going to be almost double that. You have the number of psychedelic studies that are coming in. These are peer-reviewed articles specifically on LSD. This doesn't even count MDMA and psilocybin. So it's here, and it's happening. And we've done a lot of good studies in the UK. I've been very fortunate to be both a healthy subject, receiving medicines and also administering medicines over the last 10 years. I've been variously prodded and stabbed with all sorts of things and been given LSD and DMT a couple of weeks ago, and psilocybin and ketamine and MDMA. So, in fact, ketamine was here. It took me 4 hours to find the tube station when I was released. Really, really good stuff, you know. And these are also great pharmacology studies. These are meticulous studies because we know there's going to be a lot of criticism. These are award-winning studies. You know, Robin Carhart's LSD study came out last year. It won loads of awards across the board within medicine and science. Because I think people are really keen to make them very meticulous because we know there's so much criticism. There's a plug for Breaking Convention. Breaking Convention is the world's biggest psychedelic research, international psychedelic research conference, which we put on every 2 years, and we've got our next meeting this June the 30th at Greenwich University. So come along. Also apply, submit a paper. You'll get a platform to speak. The call for papers is open. It's really cheap. It's like £70 for a three-day conference. You know, that's a round, isn't it, these days? So come along to Breaking Convention. You'll meet lots of people, loads of scientists. They're really interesting things. You're walking around and there'll be, you know, people like David Nutt and David Nichols and all these grey-suited scientists talking about their receptors in one room. You turn the corner and go into another room and there's some crazy hippie levitating, talking about the female spirits that live in the salvia leaves, you know. So it's a wonderful sort of multidisciplinary event. And I think that's what's interesting about psychedelics. Imagine a medical conference about cocaine. It'd just be, you know, the psychedelics they're intrinsically linked with art, music, literature, design, dance, culture. You know, they're fascinating in that way. They touch all aspects of humanity. So I'm really pleased I'm not talking about safety and I'm not having to talk about that. That's old news now. They're really, really safe. And in a clinical setting, they need not have any toxic effects. They treat trauma. We have to stay objective and scientific. You know, one of the things that killed this research in the 60s was too many messianic kind of approaches. So I know I do get a bit carried away thinking this is the next big thing for psychiatry because I really passionately feel it. But I have to kind of temper that a bit and just think, it might work, so we can get the research done. And this is why we do it, because this is just a little 10-year-old girl. Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions, I think. Thank you very much, Ben. That was fantastic. I'm going to kick off. That's my prerogative. So, one of the issues with the trials at the moment is that many people who come into them are on our drugs, or are on the SSRIs and the 2A antagonists. And so, what do we do with them? You know, do we take them off their drugs before treating them?
Well. Different research studies have different inclusion and exclusion criteria. Some of them are all about coming off all your other drugs. So the Silo Depth study, do you have to come off all the drugs?
Yeah, we took them off.
Yeah. So different studies have different approaches in terms of that. In our study, we're definitely taking people off drugs that interfere with MDMA, because all of the SSRIs attenuate MDMA. The amount of ravers I meet who say like, I love taking Prozac before my pill. It reduces the effect. They sort of think it doesn't. So drugs that interact with the medicine, obviously, you have to come off. I think that's just the way that research studies are. You know, you want to get a clear picture, but also it's because we're only at the early stages of doing feasibility and safety studies. The new Silo Depth study, I was talking to Robin yesterday. You know, they have a third arm in which they're comparing it with escitalopram. So it's moving on like that. But that's just typical pharmacology research. Pharmacology research goes through these phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. You start with toxicology studies on animals and tissues, then you go to healthy subjects, then you expand to clinical subjects, then you compare the drug not against placebo, but against the best current treatment. So we're just moving in that direction. Eventually we'll get full-scale studies where we're no longer using placebo arms, really. We're just comparing MDMA versus sertraline.
Any questions? And can you shout? Just so
Yes, sorry. Oh, me. Right, okay.
No, not you. Sure.
So just about potentially phase 3 trials for MDMA next year or something like that. And my question is, what's the path of money? How are you going to pay for it?
Well,
What's your strategy for getting that money?
good question, because that is the primary barrier, yeah? A lot of people will ask me at these events, does the government block these studies? They don't really. The government they don't really care. It's money. Money is by far the biggest barrier. All human psychopharmacology research is run by the pharma industry. It takes about 10 to 20 years and about $50 to $100 million to go from the chemist's laboratory to the doctor's prescription pad. That's how human pharmacology research works. And the pharma industry sponsor these drugs because they then have a product that they sell, and they sell it every day for weeks, months, years, decades. So the pharma industry think nothing of throwing 10 million at this compound, 10 million at that compound, because if it sticks, if one of them turns out to be the next Prozac, or the next sort of erectile dysfunction drug that everyone uses, they're going to make trillions. So money drives it. Now, if we had 20 million to throw at psychedelic research, my God, MDMA would be on our prescription pads in 3 years. Well, it might be in 3 years anyway, actually. But it's taken 25, 30 years for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, who are spearheading MDMA research. So, in answer to the question, MAPS are funding it, and it's funded by rich philanthropists, charity organisations, people, rich Silicon Valley techs. They die and they leave 5 million to MAPS and stuff like that. So it's hand to mouth, it's crowdfunding, it's kind of sad really. If we had that massive amount of money the pharma industry had, it would be a lot further along. So the phase 3 study is all funded by that.
Do you think the pharma industry won't put the money in to do their own research because they know that MDMA basically would mean nobody would need the rest of the drugs that they need to push into the doctors and stuff?
So we had this debate yesterday. I was talking to David about yesterday in Imperial, and we said, it's weird that pharma industry haven't started attacking us yet. It's starting to build up now, and we haven't had any attacks that we know of from the pharma industry. I think it's because they don't really think it's going to work, or they don't really believe it, or it's too small and it's not going to come to anything. Once they start seeing people coming off their SSRIs because they've had 2 sessions of MDMA and they no longer need their Prozac, I'd imagine they're going to sit up because, as I said, I don't like conspiracy theories, but I do wonder whether they're sitting there at the boardroom in Pfizer or GSK and they're sitting there thinking, right, what maintenance drug can we come up with next that will sort of get people a bit better but not cure them? I like to think they're not thinking that, but it does feel like that. So, why would anyone want a drug like this? These are what patent. No one owns MDMA, no one owns LSD or psilocybin. You need a license to make them, but they're generic drugs. And but crucially, you don't have to keep using them. Where's the money in a drug that you use twice and then never need to use again? So, who's going to pay?
And what if, until it's supposedly legal and everything, what if somebody who's taken antidepressants for years wants to come off them and try this? Where do they go? Where do they start? Because have they got to wait till the people that are the ones that want to stop it say it's okay to do? Otherwise, these people are going to carry on antidepressants. Do they have to do their own trial by MDMA?
I'm certainly not going to stand here and say come off your medical drugs.
But what if somebody did want to try this, but they can't?
Well,
That's a risk.
Well, people can do what they want. The patient is the boss.
Yeah.
I work for the patient. They don't work for me. So,
but there's no way you can do that.
Yeah, there is no mechanism. I get 5 emails a week. Dr. Sessa, can I have MDMA? Can you deliver this? And I just have to say no. I just say there's no legal mechanism. It's we have to wait for these drugs to be licensed, and then we'll start prescribing them. But at the moment, there isn't. Now, there is a whole rich culture of underground therapy, and a lot of people, when I then email them and say, sorry, you can't do that, I always say there is no legal mechanism. They'll go, do you know of any underground therapists? And at that point, because in case the FBI are checking my emails, I say, no, I don't. I couldn't possibly help you. So there are underground therapists. There are loads of people since the 60s onwards who will be delivering these drugs in a therapeutic setting. But it's illegal. It's illegal. These drugs are all illegal in every country in the world.
But these places exist.
Yeah. Probably people in this room. Yeah, it certainly depends on people that break into dimension. But I have to be well clear of that, you know, I have to steer
Yeah,
clear of that.
obviously, but for somebody who's not going to have to wait for them to be told it's okay to go to somebody like you in a therapy, there's people out there on antidepressants that don't want to be on them anymore.
Yeah.
There is no alternative, like you say. So
No, there's no legal alternative.
it's worth their risk to come off those and
Yeah.
maybe try it their own way. It's just getting the pure stuff. Obviously.
Yeah, getting the pure stuff. And that it's done in a therapeutic way.
Well, of course, and
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking about that. I'm not talking about, you know, because
Actually, a lot of people, a lot of psychedelic users are not mad hedonists, actually. There's a lot of people who will take psychedelics once or twice a year in a facilitative setting. You know, it's not like, you don't go down the pub, have a couple of pints and then drop 3 microdose when you've got to go to work the next day. You know, you plan it, you go away to your wonderful cottage in Wales and you know, have your friends and
what about microdosing?
Can I come back to some other questions and I'll come back to that?
I just remember seeing some evidence about people who actually recreationally having a decreased affect subsequently for a few days. Had that been a problem at all during?
Okay, great question. And that's one of the things we're looking at in our tolerability study. Blue Tuesday, Black Monday, Green Wednesday, I don't know what people call it, ravers call it these days. You know, the low that comes 2 or 3 days after ecstasy use. The theory behind it is, oh man, I've depleted all my serotonin stores and now I'm really low. I don't think it is, you know, and we don't see it clinically. It just doesn't appear clinically, not in a significant number. A few people, but not that many. My theory of this is it's a hangover, yeah? People go out to a club, they drink 6 pints, they drop 2 ecstasy tablets at midnight, they drop another 2 at 4 o'clock in the morning, they go back to someone's house, they do loads of amphetamine, they smoke loads of spliffs, someone opens a bottle of wine, they maybe crawl to bed for 2 hours on the Sunday evening and drink a bit of soup, and then, of course they feel like crap on a Monday morning. It's a hangover, yeah? Now, when we deliver this clinically, you know, they've slept, they come in the clinic at 9 a.m. in the morning after they've had a good night's sleep, they've fasted, they take the medicine, they're down by 5 or 6 in the evening, they have a nice big meal, they go to sleep, they wake up feeling great. When I had to take MDMA therapy, I had to undergo the therapy myself, and I had this like 5-6 day afterglow, like the LSD, after MDMA. So, I don't think it's borne out clinically. We're going to be looking at it, and that's why we're doing this 7-day telephone calls, and we're going to be measuring affect in those days afterwards. But it's not a big thing. And again, we mustn't make inferences about what we see from recreational use and suggest it's going to happen clinically, because it might just be an outlier effect, really, or a confounding effect. Good question, though. Yeah.
So you spoke about childhood trauma and adults, but what about the adult trauma, like veterans or people of war zones that have adult trauma? Do they work the same way? Because you're talking a lot about the attachment.
Yeah.
That's not a problem.
Well, it is actually, because the majority of adult PTSD from post-combat PTSD has links to developmental problems. You know, you send 100 soldiers into the field, 5 of them come back with PTSD and the other 95 don't. The concept of resilience is really important in PTSD. Why do people not get traumatized? And it's the ones who've got solid foundations of attachment. And actually, the majority of people with post-combat PTSD, when you then go into the work with them, it's because it's opening up old past trauma. Now, not all of them, and there'll be cases who have had wonderful childhoods and perfectly good attachment relationships, but underlying most adult problems is a tricky childhood. Yeah.
In regards to the therapy, what extent is it an introverted experience and what extent is it an active talking therapy?
So the MDMA session itself is very non-directed. Much like the psilocybin sessions I think that you do and the other psychedelic therapies, a lot of time is spent lying down on a bed with eye patches on and earphones, just going inside, being with the experience. There's a little bit of gentle nudging about, you know, remember we're here to talk about your brother and the stuff we've talked about, but it's really those non-drug sessions where you do the preparatory work. Now, a lot of people, it's a good question, you know, what is the therapeutic model? What's the psychotherapeutic model in which we deliver this? The simple answer, which is a bit fluffy, is we're making it up as we go along. And I mean that in the most professional way, in that it is MDMA therapy, and it is unique, and we're developing it. I'm not going to say it's CBT or psychoanalysis or transpersonal psychotherapy. It has bits of all of them, but we're building it. And MAPS, who are developing this phase 3 PTSD, they have a very manualised approach. They have a MAPS manual of how to do it. And it draws on a lot of transpersonal aspects. It draws on a lot of trauma aspects. It draws somewhat on behavioural aspects and cognitive aspects. But the simple answer is MDMA therapy is MDMA therapy, and it's quite unique. A lot of it surrounds being with. I was talking to some psychotherapists this afternoon. What do they call it? Compassionate, self-compassion therapy. You heard of that? What's it called? Compassion therapy. You know, learning to recognise that you are a good person. There's quite a lot of that in MDMA therapy, because these people who hate themselves don't believe they deserve to be good. And MDMA is really good at bringing that out, of a sense of mindfulness as well, you know, a sense of... I mean, I'm giving such a rubbish answer, I'm sorry, because it does draw on so many different aspects of psychology. So it's kind of unique as well.
I think I'll add something to it.
Yeah.
For me, it's about forming a relationship with the self, and elements of the self that hitherto you've rejected for whatever reason. And to that extent, it's very individual, but the preparation then is about preparing someone as an individual and defining their intention and what it is that they want to focus on, and encouraging them gently to do that, and forming a compassionate relationship with it. That's how I explain it.
I think that finding that sense of self, you know, like I described that ego dissolution experience in the scanner that I had with psilocybin, you know, there's a lot to be said for stripping down those labels that are negative and rigid, and then building them up in a positive way. And, you know, and people, you know, on MDMA, they say, I didn't know I could feel like this. And also they have this empathy. It's quite extraordinary. You know, to be able to say, my dad must have been in a really bad place himself to have done that to me when I was 6. That is an incredibly important thing. It's incredibly empathic for a survivor of child sexual abuse to be able to say. You know, you can spend years in psychotherapy before a patient says that. And they can say that in a single MDMA session.
Alcohol and drug issues. To what extent does a previous experience of use of MDMA then affect a parenting instance?
Okay, that's a good question. One of the exclusion criteria we're using in our Bristol study is, we're not saying no previous use of MDMA because it's Bristol, you know, you have to take MDMA. We're saying no more than 6 occasions no use in the previous 6 months, and no more than 10 lifetime use. And we're just saying that to sort of weed out any ravers who fancy signing up just to get a free burn.
Because obviously you said that the first experience is obviously the one you're more likely to have a more spiritual experience in. I'm just wondering whether that would still count, because obviously the difference between taking recreational MDMA, I imagine is very different to taking a therapeutic dose when you don't have.
No, it really is, and it's a good question, and it's a really good question because it is very different. Yeah. Now, I mean, I'm quite happy to say I've taken recreational MDMA, but I didn't inhale. And it's very different. You know, when you're taking it in a therapeutic context and you're working with these 2 wonderful therapists and you've spent weeks preparing for it and you lie down on the couch, it's very different, you know. Also, what's weird about it is it's a very internalised experience. When people take ecstasy recreationally, it's all about the external. It's all shout, lasers, dance, you know, hugs. You know, you're lying in dark silence on your own, no touching anyone, in your own zone. It's completely different. Imagine a rave where 5,000 people all lie down on the floor with their eyes closed. I mean, actually, it's probably like a boom, isn't it? But it's totally different. Yeah, it's very. I mean, some people do take MDMA like that. I know plenty of people who recreationally take MDMA like they take classical psychedelics in darkness with eye shades on, in stillness. You know, it's a very different experience from that externalising behaviour that goes with recreational use. Yeah.
I know you mentioned earlier that the cost of
Is there a, do you know the reason for that? Would that present a problem in the future?
Well, I mean, it won't present a problem once it's a licensed drug and everyone's making it. It's just you have to get a lab that's willing to do it. It's not hard to make MDMA. As an organic chemist, you can make MDMA, and you can make pretty good MDMA as well. It's not the purity of it that makes it so expensive. It's the fact that it's got to be what's called GMP quality, which means it's got to be made in a certain lab with a certain sort of glassware and a certain technique. So there's plenty of half-decent organic chemists that can make MDMA at the sort of 70 to 90% purity rate. And there's actually a little bit, a decent academic lab, or most decent chemical facilities could make decent MDMA up to about the sort of 97 to 98% rate. But it's that final 1%, final couple of percent to take it up to 99.98 that makes it very, very expensive. You destroy all the glassware after every run. They've spent a long time working on different syntheses to get the very highest yields with absolutely no impurities, and they strip the whole machine and take out all the glassware, new glassware every run. So it gets to be very expensive when you're doing it like that. Obviously, once it becomes an industrialised thing, then it'll be cheap.
What's the logic behind having such high purity?
That's the MHRA, the drugs agency that allow clinical studies with humans. That's what they expect. Fluoxetine and all these things that are prescribed, they are that level of purity. On animal studies, so Rick Doblin, the guy who runs MAP, he's got 990 grams of 99% pure MDMA in a safe in Florida. That's useless now because he made kilo for the first group of animal studies. And they've probably used about 100 grams of it. There's 900 grams of it left, but it's useless. They don't know what to do with it. Plenty of people would love 99% pure MDMA, but it's no good for this next lot of human studies. So it just needs to be this very high purity, and that's just what the MHRA stipulate. Yeah.
How long do you have to be in Scanner for?
In Scanner? Well, different studies, really. Most scans are about 60 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes, and you do all these different tasks and things.
Comfortable? Were you kind of mentally prepared for that?
An fMRI scanner is not the ideal place to take a high-dose classical psychedelic. It's got to be said. Have you heard what they sound like? Psytrance is really, really like Mozart next to it. It's like for an hour. Yeah, really loud, and you're strapped in a metal tube with a needle in your arm and a tape across your chest and a plastic tube up your nose, being injected with LSD, and that for an hour and a half. So you have to be quite a confident psychedelic user in that space, in that mental space, to do it. I've taken way more drugs in scanners than I have outside of scanners in the last 10 years. Yeah.
When you say that if you're waiting for it to get licensed, is that when the law needs to change, or can you do it now?
It's like I said, you just have to jump through hoops to get a drug license. To get a drug to be a prescription medicine, it has to go through these hoops. What's kind of a bit weird about psychedelic licensing is, usually when the laboratories come up with this new chemical, and it's, usually they start out with just some name like RS476, and later on it becomes Prozac, but it's just some chemical. And they have to go through the animal studies, the tissue studies, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. What's weird about LSD, psilocybin, even cannabis, we know the toxicity of these drugs. We've known about them for thousands of years, cannabis. Yet we're having to treat it like it's a brand new drug. It's having to go through all these things. So that's just the typical hoops that you have to go through before a drug becomes a marketable prescription drug. And it takes a long time.
But that would inform then rescheduling the drugs. The problem at the moment is there's Schedule 1. Cannabis is Schedule 1, but there is a preparation of cannabis now licensed for multiple sclerosis called Sativex, which has been rescheduled to Schedule 4, so it's now prescribable. But as it exists, as psychedelics exist at the moment, and MDMA, they're not prescribable outside of a research study, which sort of speaks of the bit of a self-reinforcing cycle of why we haven't been able to do the studies thus far.
It's a catch-22, because it's very hard to do studies on the Schedule 1 drugs, because you have to justify why you're doing a clinical study on a drug that has no clinical use. But it's only categorised as has no clinical use because no one's done any studies. So it's like, well, you can't prove that it has a clinical use. Yeah, okay, so give us a license so we can prove it. Well, we can't give you a license because it's a Schedule 1 drug. Yes, well, how do we not make it a Schedule 1 drug? You have to do some studies. Okay, can we have a permission? No, it's a Schedule 1 drug. Have some alcohol. Yeah.
Do you foresee MDMA, psilocybin and things like that, classical psychedelics, we tend to think of them as being maybe a couple of doses and do you see MDMA as being regular interval doses over long periods or just in 2 drugs?
That's a really good question, and I can answer your microdosing question. So, microdosing is very much the flavour of the day at the moment. In classicals, loads of people are talking about 10 to 20 microgram doses of LSD, sub-psychedelic doses that they take every day, and don't have a psychedelic effect, but have a kind of neuro-enhancing, cognitive-enhancing type effect.
I mean in treatment.
In treatment, so this is a really good question. And I don't know, and I've thought about this a lot. What would happen if we gave MDMA as a daily antidepressant at the 10 to 15 milligram dose? From a receptor point of view, it would increase levels of monoamines, serotonin. It'd probably be quite good. I don't know, I don't know, it's an interesting question. I'm not really interested in doing that because I really want to get away from the concept of daily dosing. I really like the idea of it being an enhancer of psychotherapy. So what's quite interesting because everyone I know who's interested in psychedelics, from medical psychedelics, they're not big into drugs, weirdly. Everyone focuses on the drugs thing. They're all psychotherapists at heart, myself included. You know, my work with children has been very informative in that respect. I don't see these as drugs like the other drugs we use in psychiatry. These are drugs that we use a couple of times to provide a good focused form of psychotherapy that then works. So, I don't know, I'm sure someone at some point will come up with a way of using MDMA on a daily basis, but I think we start getting into probably more toxic problems.
A couple more questions, then we'll wrap up.
What do you think it would be to kind of bring the government round on these? Because I've read through most of David Frank's book on everything, and when he kind of was absolutely, it was very much shut down. Really acknowledged all because they did a bit of declassify it, then it seems less harmful, whereas even though it should be in category A harmful, do you reckon there will be a point where research gets to the point where government will come around to...
I mean, never
Politics
mind.
is not like that, though, is it?
Never mind. I mean, no, it's a really good question because, you know, I've made it really clear about my feelings of the Misuse of Drugs Act. It's very, very frustrating as a scientist in this field, yeah? I'm a scientist. I work with an evidence-based data set, yeah? If something works, then we can do it. Why wouldn't we? Politics around drug laws do not have a scientific basis. They're most peculiar. And it leaves me feeling rather impotent as a psychiatrist. I don't know how you tackle this question, to be honest. All I can do is the same as David did. Write reams of paper and slap it onto the Home Secretary's desk and say, look. But it doesn't make any difference if David found when he lost his job at ACMB. You know, I contributed to that report that ended up getting him sacked. You'd think that evidence base is what would shift hearts and minds in the government, but politics has its own rules. A really good example, and you know, when will it change? Politicians talk about what they call the seatbelt effect. The seatbelt effect is the concept that a government can be very rigid on something for many, many, many years, and then change very quickly. And the idea being seatbelts in cars. Yeah? For 40 years, Royal College of Physicians lobbied successive governments to say, make seatbelts in cars compulsory. And, you know, they had all this data, head injuries, car accident deaths, you know, it would massively save lives. And every single government for 40 years said, no way, it could never be done. There'd be riots in the streets, the people would never stand for it, it would be political suicide. One day they just did it, and 3 minutes later, everyone wears a seatbelt. And it's, why didn't we do this 40 years ago? Smoking in pubs is the same. You know, it would never be done. All College of Physicians have been lobbying the government for decades for that. Decades. It's the sort of 1963 was the report, wasn't it? It was like a Dole report, wasn't it? And it took until quite recently. The hope is they would take the same approach with drugs. It's quite clear that the war on drugs has been a terrible, terrible social failure.
Do you think it will go in the same pattern though?
Well, I don't know.
It's so long before that.
I think in answer to the question, it's not just going to be people like myself and David who are going to do it, because data alone doesn't seem to work. Like I said, we need a more creative approach. We need literature. We need TV programs. We need EastEnders to mention drugs, but not in the stereotypical thing. Not like somebody takes LSD who either dies, or the opposite. You know, they grow dreads and wear rainbow jumpers and, you know, start loving dolphins and stuff. So we don't want that. We just want normal people, you know, sitting in the pub. I took ayahuasca last week. How was it? Yeah, it's great. Move on. Yeah. And actually, if you look at other changes, social changes, homosexuality, you know, all of that work that was done in the 60s and 70s, that placard waving, militant change of law was necessary. Okay, it was necessary. But it wasn't really until the 90s, where homosexuality was normalised, that things actually changed in terms of hearts and minds. It wasn't really the guys in the streets with the placards. It was just the realisation that, oh, you know, the plumber, Terry, he's gay, is he? Oh, yeah, that's when it changed. And I think that's what we need with psychedelics. And this is one of my real passions at the moment, is I wrote a part for the Breaking Convention book on this. Normalising psychedelics, out with the hippies, cut the hair, you know, none of this anymore. It's just normal stuff. Everyone takes psychedelics, everyone smokes weed. They don't have to have the dreads, they don't have to like chakras and go off to the Peruvian jungle. They're just estate agents that do it at the weekend. That's how it is. And I think we need to really start pushing that message, because the hippies don't get a foot in the door at number 10. So we need this more measured approach.
Do you think that normalising the both push not only the obviously the medical use, but increase the number of recreational users that assume it's safe?
It is safe.
But the recreational kind of stuff.
That's safe too. It is.
No, I'm disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that when you buy MDMA, you're not always buying MDMA.
Yeah.
In that
Yeah.
sense.
So,
kind of,
oh man, this is a massive topic. We could go on. Let's talk about this.
Yeah. Let's talk about
it is a massive topic. You know, I could talk about data from Portugal and all the rest of it, but no, legalisation of drugs does not result in the destruction of society or more harm. It reduces it, and that's what the data is showing. Less Class A users, less teenage pregnancies, less homelessness, less intravenous use when you legalise drugs. It's the prohibition of drugs that causes harm, and the data's solid there.
Should we end on that message?
Yeah.
And then, because we're going to the pub now, and you can join us for a drink and ask Ben more questions. But you join me in thanking Ben again for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.